video, we'll step through my process of selecting and rating the images. My goal is to narrow down the selection of images to only those that I think are worth investing the time on to maximize their potential. I'm hesitant to stay to a finished state because I often tweak an image after I've lived with it for a while and can see it with fresh eyes. And that's the beauty of Lightroom's non-destructive workflow method. So I view editing as an iterative process. So with each editing pass, I'm narrowing down and refining the selection of images. And by consistently using the star rating system, I'm able to narrow down searches to view only the best images, which may be a 4-star and above, to all images that are worth considering, perhaps 1 star and above. And by applying this system consistently over time, you can look back through your entire catalogue of images and quickly view your best images, or even the past month, or whatever subset you like. And your decisions are not set in stone. You can always re-evaluate an image later and decide whether to increase or decrease its star rating. To demonstrate my sorting process, I have 1,083 raw captures in a Lightroom library. They've had no processing applied to them, so it's the same as if I'd come back from a 5-day shoot with 1,083 images to sort and process. It's a bit overwhelming to sort that amount of images in one group, so my first task is to separate them into logical groups for processing. In Lightroom's library module, I use the # key to bring up the filter panel. With the default columns layout selected, I see I can separate the images into day of each shoot, by the camera used, or even the lens used. In my case, I know that one camera was only used for time-lapse photography, and I know I want to process the time-lapse images separately using a program called LR Timelapse. So for now, I just need to hide these images. My initial thought was to do this by making a smart collection that hides the images shot with the time-lapse camera. But a smart collection won't let me view images as stacks or manually reorder images, so I decided to make a standard collection and just call it not time-lapse. I make sure all the images except the time-lapse images are selected, then right-click on the enclosing folder in the Collections panel and choose the option Create Collection. I make sure Inside Collection Set and Include Selected Photos are ticked and click OK. So that narrows the selection down from 1,083 to 736. For this 736 batch of images, I think it will be more manageable to sort through them by the day of the shoot and also by the camera they were shot on. I can do this in the filter bar by clicking on the shoot day in the first column, then the camera in the second column. This breaks the whole shoot down into more manageable chunks. So on day 1, I have 62 images taken with my Sony 7R4, so I'll start the sorting process there. In the first pass, I'm aiming to do 2 things. Number 1 is to join any stitched or HDR images together into their composite image. And number 2, to give any image worthy of consideration at least 1 star. It helps to see the star rating system as a pyramid, so as you go up through the pyramid levels, there are fewer images all the way to your 5-star images, which should be your best of the best from your entire collection. So you can quickly narrow down your selection of images by using Lightroom's filtering capabilities. The star rating system is really an efficient way of viewing your best images over your whole collection or any subset of your collection. I'll come back to this once I've sorted and rated my images towards the end of the video. I can see with this first group of images I've shot quite a few as panoramas, so my first task is to stitch those together. I always shoot my panoramas from left to right, so it's easy to see images intended for panorama stitching. I can see I have at least one group which is intended for a multi-row stitch. These will be processed in much the same way as a single row. I sometimes shoot multi-row panoramas because I don't have any standard zoom lenses, and this allows me to effectively shoot focal lengths in between the 24, the 50 and the 85mm prime lenses that I have. I also like the fact that you effectively give yourself a medium format camera resolution just with a standard 35mm camera system. So let's work through the panoramas. Once I've selected the images for the first panorama, I use the keyboard shortcut Control-M to bring up the Merged Panorama dialog box. I'm going to use Fill Edges to fill in the distorted border, and the only other checkbox I want selected is Create Stack. So this creates a stack in the grid mode of the library module with the finished panorama on top of the stack of images that we used to make it. And it's a good way to keep your grid view uncluttered. So the completed stitched panorama and HDR images are given 1 star if I think they're worthy of further processing. Now here's a trick for processing a lot of similar panoramas. If I select the next group of images intended for a panorama, and instead of Control-M, I use Shift-Control-M, I can skip the Merged Panorama dialog box and the images automatically start processing in the background with the last used settings. And as you go through your collection and keep using this shortcut, more processing just gets added to the list of processing, so it's all done in the background. It's quite an efficient way to get through a lot of panoramas. I've processed the panoramas in this batch of images, so now I'll isolate them by going to the third column in the filter bar and making sure it is set to file type. From here I can see Lightroom has generated DNG files for the stitched panoramas. On a side note, Lightroom does use a lossy form of compression when generating these panorama or HDR files. I would prefer to switch this off, but Lightroom does not offer that option. However, I haven't found any noticeable drop in image quality over the years that I have used this lossy DNG file for my stitched panoramas. I select all of the panoramas and hit the N key to go into survey mode and Shift Tab to hide all panels. I can see that some of the panoramas are very similar, so if I hover over ones I don't want, I get the option of hitting an X button to remove panoramas from the selection. Once I have it down to the images I want for 1 star, I hit the 1 key to give them a 1-star rating. Next I look at the individual RAW files I've shot. The first 3 are not worth rating, but the second 3 are worth considering where the sun's hit the side of the hill. Of these 3, it looks like I've used a polarizing filter on the last one, as the sky is darker and the clouds have much more definition, so I give this one a 1 star. The remaining raw captures were taken with a 100-400 lens, as I'd noticed someone climbing along the ridge to the far point of Castle Rock. I'll often take a few images when something like this is unfolding, as you can never be sure when you're going to get the best shot, and if you wait too long for the best shot you might miss out on getting anything at all. So once again I select all the images, then alternate between the N key and for compare mode, and also the space bar which views an individual image in loop mode. I can also use the scroll wheel on my mouse to scroll through the images at full screen. When I'm in loop mode, which is the image filling the screen, and hit the 1 key, I can give an image a 1-star rating. Just be aware that auto sync needs to be switched off, otherwise all of the selected images will get a 1-star rating, not just the most selected image. You can find the toggle for auto sync at the bottom of the right hand panel in the library module. So with this group of images I end up selecting 2 images from the set for a 1-star rating. And you may have noticed that I'm not spending any time adjusting color or exposure on any of the images. I'd rather save this work for the images that I really want to show. I sometimes will make an exposure or color change, but it's only to help me decide whether the image is going to be a keeper or a sleeper. The only images I delete completely are images that are completely over or underexposed or are way out of focus. The hard drive space is cheap, and you never know if you might change your mind about an image in the future. Now onto the drone shots. I select the drone camera to isolate the drone images. I simply go through the same process for this batch of images. The only difference is that I can see that I've bracketed exposures for some of the panoramas, which is something I do quite often when shooting into the sun because of the very large brightness range. I like to use a red flag to temporarily isolate a single bracketed panorama group. I can do this by just clicking the number 6 number key. And with these red flagged images isolated, I can decide how I want to process them. Now here is where I run into what is possibly a bug in Lightroom. I can see this bracketed panorama has been exposed correctly. It's a 3-image panorama, with each bracket having 5 exposures between 1/120th of a second and 1/800th of a second. Aperture and ISO have been left the same throughout, so I should be able to use the Lightroom command merge to HDR panorama, but it just doesn't work. The only workaround I've found is to separately merge to HDR each bracketed set and then photo merge the resulting HDR images. It's a bit clumsy, but it gets me there in the end. The advantage of an HDR merged panorama is that it contains all of the highlight detail and the shadow detail in one file. If we have a look at this HDR panorama, you can see that I can adjust the exposure all the way from -10 to +10. If I compare that to a single HDR, non-HDR exposure, in this case the lightest exposure of the brackets, you can see I only have the range -5 to +5 to work with, and the highlight area is completely blown out and not recoverable, although the shadow area has plenty of detail. And if we compare that to the darkest exposure at 1/800th of a second, I can see I have good highlight detail, but the shadow areas are a bit grainy and noisy when I lighten them up. Although actually I could get away with this grain and noise in the shadow area if I'm not wanting to lighten the shadows too much. So you can see it's quite a juggling act to decide how much work you actually need to do to get a multi-bracketed image, panorama image that you're happy with out of these bracketed exposures. So in this case, I'd probably be happy with the darkest exposure and not bother with the extra work involved in making an HDR panorama. I've sped up the remainder of the processing because I'm just repeating the same procedure for every day of the shoot, processing panoramas and rating images as I go. And I'm only doing just enough tonal correction to be able to evaluate whether an image is worth giving a 1-star rating or not. Now for the second pass of the images. This is when I review the star ratings. So firstly, I select 1 star in the attribute section of the filter bar and make sure that the option is set to greater than or equal to. You can find the options just to the left of the stars. It makes sense to view the images in the order they were taken, and to check this I use the T keyboard shortcut to bring up the toolbar and make sure that the sort order is set to capture time or file name if your file names are in chronological order, as mine are. So sometimes this involves doing a little bit of tonal adjustment or cropping to be able to properly evaluate the images. I also compare very similar images and decide which ones get a higher rating. In this second pass of the images, the aim is just to make a quick decision on which images are worth spending more time on in the final part of the editing stage, which is the third pass, and I'll be covering that next week when we finesse or take images through to their finished state. My process does include a lot of bracketed exposure panorama stitching, and I realize that that may not be everyone's way of shooting, but the principles are still the same. Use Lightroom's tools such as collections and the filter bar to isolate images into logical chunks to organize. So in conclusion, the editing process is just a way to narrow down your selection of images so that you spend the most time developing your best images, and these are rated with the most stars so you can quickly isolate your best images from a shoot, a month, or your entire collection at any time. So in the third and final part of this video series, we'll look at developing these selected images to the best that they can be. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.